I think it's very important we talk about peatlands and we understand their history, their past, their present, their future. Peatlands have been forming in the UK for around about 10,000 years now. So you have to think about peatlands as containing the past. They are the past, locked away in the peat that's accumulated over all those years. So they record our history. They record the history of people, of our culture, of our land use, of our climate change over all of that time. However, we also have peatlands in the present day, and peatlands are in various types of condition across the country, which is why we're busy restoring those that are degraded. But we also need to consider peatlands in terms of our future, and the future role that peatlands play is very much to do with climate change. Peatlands are our biggest store of carbon in the UK, so it's really vital that our peatlands are kept in good condition, so we keep that carbon locked away in the ground and we don't allow those greenhouse gases to escape to our atmosphere and add to our climate change problem. So I'm going to be talking about restoration and the technical aspects of restoration. However, with restoration, you get a bucket load of other benefits as well, and I hope you get a sense of that through the talks this evening. So peatlands really underpin so much. They are really important for carbon, they're really important habitats, but they're really important in terms of our history and our culture. They're important for our rural economy and how we sustain our communities in rural areas as well, particularly in Dumfries and Galloway. Peatlands are really, really vital. So I really hope you get a sense of that through the talks this evening. And Jane will sum up some of these benefits and why we're really keen to look at them all through our Peatland Connections project with the Crichton Carbon Centre. Okay, so firstly, where are peatlands? Well, in the UK, they're mostly found in Scotland. In Scotland, we have around about 1.8 million hectares of peatlands. Peatlands form in the wetter climates along the west. So you'll see really big hotspots for deeper peats out here in the Western Isles. This is Lewis and Harris. And then we have up in the north of the country, all of you have probably heard about the Flow Country. This is it up here. But then look down here in the southwest, you'll see lots and lots of deep peats throughout the Galloway region and also within the Glenkens and Galloway Glens area in particular. In a European context, you know, UK peats are still very important. So we are now really recognising their importance. Scottish Government very committed to peatland restoration. They see it key to really achieving our net zero target by 2045. So Scottish Government announced earlier this year £250 million for peatland restoration over the next 10 years. So it's really amazing that we're starting to understand and appreciate that these often undervalued areas now need really carefully looked after. So that's great. Back to kind of my job and working more locally, we have lots of lovely maps that show peatland extent across the UK or even across Scotland or even across the region. However, often when I'm faced with looking at peatland management, peatland restoration, I need to understand peatland at a very local level. So where is it? On a farm, on an estate, on a hillside, in a field? So this requires me going out with a peat probe, and it's basically to measure our peat depth and extent across an area. Now, peat depth is really important for us to know because not only does it inform the kind of restoration that peatland may need, but it's actually quite critical to understand from a management point of view. Now, if you take one thing away from my talk this evening, it's take away 50 centimetres. So 50 centimetres is the cutoff. 50 centimetres and anything more than 50 centimetres deep, that is regarded as deep peat. And if you've got more than 50 centimetres depth, then that means you can access funding through, for example, Peatland Action through the National Programme for Peatland Restoration. So we're always looking for our deeper peats. However, they're also really important for other management systems. So you can't be planting any new forestry, for example, on peats greater than 50 centimetres as well. So 50 centimetres is really quite a critical depth, and that informs a lot of what we do. It's kind of arbitrary, but we have 50 centimetres as technically deep peat here in Scotland. So peat depths. We spend a lot of time going out and about, collecting peat depth data and creating maps like this. Now, this is a map that some of you may have seen before. This is of the area to the west of Clattering Shaws Loch in the Galloway Glens area. So this is Clattering Shaws here. And this is kind of a valley basin here And you'll see the darker the dots, so the redder the dots, the deeper the peat. So you can actually very quickly see there are definitely shallow peats, so all the white stuff, that's shallow peats, but there's these pockets of deep peat. Now, with a bit of spatial analysis, a bit of jiggery pokery, you can pull together a map that looks like this. And this is just overlaid over a contemporary aerial image of the area. And what's really interesting and really important to think about when we're considering peatland restoration and peatland management is that these areas of deep peat, which you can see in the darker kind of bruised looking areas here, so there's a big lens of deep peat there, big lens of deep peat in here, and same again over here and again over here. Now, these big areas of peat, they don't marry up with our contemporary management units, which is, in this instance, it's the forestry coups. So straight away, that sort of says is, right, well, we need to be considering how we go about management over that wider area. And that may mean considering management of different coups of forestry, which may be due to be felled at different times, for example. But what it really shows is with peatland management restoration, you have to think about the peat unit itself. Peatland does not respect fence lines. It does not respect land ownership. So often our peatland restoration projects require lots of engagement with different people, different land managers, and trying to bring that together so the restoration you do makes sense in that kind of ecological scale of peatland. So it's quite an interesting thing to understand, and this is why we do go out and about a lot doing our peat depth surveys, so we can understand the distribution of our deep peats. Now, here's quite a typical example of a lovely peat bog. This is very probably what you imagine when I say peat bog. It's brown, looks quite far away, it's obviously a bit wet, looks pretty uniform, not much there. However, it's really important to understand that underneath the surface here, in the depths of the peat, are really, really important processes to understand. To understand from a kind of carbon cycling point of view, but to understand from a hydrology point of view, because all this goes on to inform our restoration plans and our management strategies. So a really good thing to think about, firstly, is the hydrology of a peatland. Now, peatlands are very nutrient poor. That's because they are rainwater fed. So what that means, their nutrients come to them through rainwater in a natural state. So they're not influenced by groundwater, which is often much more nutrient rich. So they're nutrient poor. So they're waiting for the rain to come from the atmosphere in the form of snow or rain. And now that water will infiltrate into a bog. Now bogs need to be wet. They need to be wet, anoxic, acidic, and that's what slows down the decay process, allows a build-up of organic carbon and the accumulation of peat over time. So water is really critical to a peat bog. Sphagnum moss, for example, underpins a peat bog and the kind of processes within a bog, and that needs a wet habitat. But so water can interact from the atmosphere, can reach your bog and infiltrate into your bog, and then the water may move kind of very microscopically at the pore level, kind of flow through the peat, or it may move a lot more rapidly through pipe flow. So within the peat, so you think about the cross-section of peat, the depth of the peat, you get what's called peat pipes. And these are voids in the peat body itself where water can flow. It may flow at different times under different sort of weather conditions or different flow conditions. So there can be a really dynamic kind of flow of water within the bog itself. And this is really evident at one of our most famous bogs in Galloway and the Galloway Glens area, Silver Flow, where there's a fantastic network of peat pipes and there's these huge holes. So you need to be quite careful in Silver Flow, but these huge deep, sort of 6 foot deep holes you can actually jump into, and you can put your hand into these peat pipes and you realise there's a whole network of these peat pipes and a whole load of dynamic water flow throughout. Now you can also lose water from a bog naturally in the form of evapotranspiration, and this is basically the process of photosynthesis. So plants that use sunlight for energy, through that process, they put H2O water back out to the atmosphere. And you can get different types of flow over the surface of a peatland as well. And all this is really important for us to understand. So it's about water flow at the surface, but also within the peat depth itself, because this may go on to inform how we go about constructing our restoration plans, which we'll come on to a wee bit later. Now, water is really critical to a peatland. It underpins the really dynamic set of processes that are always ongoing on a peat bog. So the photograph I have here in the background shows a very brown, very uniform looking sort of site. However, within that, within the depths, all these processes are all ongoing. And if these processes are all in sync, well, over time, you're going to get a net accumulation of peat and a net accumulation of carbon. But you can naturally get methane, which is a greenhouse gas emitted from a bog. You naturally get CO2, carbon dioxide uptake into a bog, and carbon dioxide release from a bog. So all this is natural. However, if all these processes are in sync, then you get your peat accumulation, and that's what we really want to see. However, if you get a system where all these things are not quite in balance, the system is degraded to some degree, the water table being absolutely critical to this, so the height of the water table, then these processes will be out of sync. So you may be losing more carbon than you should. You may not have the right vegetation composition that you should. So the whole thing will be out of sync. Now, unfortunately, most of our peatlands in the UK are degraded to some extent. And the most common form of degradation, really, from an ecological sense, in the hydrology sense, is through artificial drainage. And I hope you can see my mouse here, but you'll see all these little linear features here. And these are all artificially cut drains. And we spent a long time trying to drain our peatlands to try and improve them for grazing, for agricultural purposes. And now we're realizing actually some of these places we drained, that was not a good idea to be doing that. And it's through no fault often of the land managers. You know, the government paid grants to do drainage to try and make these grounds more productive. But now we understand that actually we need to be restoring these types of areas. Because the problems with drains, and here's a great example of a very odd drain on Ben Lomond actually. You can see it's a double drain, and I think simply what's happened here, one drain has infilled over time, and so someone's come along and dug a drain next to it to try and keep the drainage system going. But what happens is, with drainage, you get an artificial lowering of the water table, which can lead to a release of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So already you see that those systems, those processes are out of sync. And this is probably going to become more of a concern with climate change, where we see these very dry spells, particularly in the spring and the early summer months. We'll be getting more of a drawdown of our water table. And so more of our processes will be out of sync and we'll probably get net release of carbon to the atmosphere. So it's really important we look to restore the hydrology here. Now, drains, they can facilitate the loss of water, but they can actually also lead to erosion as well. And this is an example of a drain which is found at the bottom of the slope. So at the top of the slope, the drain just looked like a little narrow, sort of 50 centimetres wide, 50 centimetres deep drain. But actually the bottom of the system, it looked like this, leading to huge erosion and direct loss of peat and carbon to the atmosphere. Now you also get more serious types of degradation, and this is kind of what we would term active erosion. And this is where you're losing a lot of carbon. So you're losing carbon through the process of peat oxidation and release of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. But you're also simply just seeing peat getting washed away in front of your eyes often in a downpour. So peat's getting washed away in the form of dissolved organic carbon, which gets washed away into our rivers and streams and can have downstream impacts on fish and invertebrates. But you're also getting just direct loss of peat in the form of particulate organic carbon as well. So these are really real sources of carbon emissions. So we are spending a lot of time and effort trying to restore sites like this. So lots of particulate and dissolved organic carbon being lost at pretty rapid rates on some sites. Some sites we see are kind of in between. They may have been a bit kind of artificially drained, but we see signs like this, which to me would be a bit of a warning sign. This system might go into a more active erosion phase. So this would be absolutely key for restoration. And of course, we have afforested a lot of our peatland soils, particularly in this region as well. We've got a lot of standing conifer crops on our deep peats. And through the process of forestry and the ground preparation to make way for crops of conifers, we've done a lot of drainage. We've done a lot of ploughing. So you get a really modified topography, lots of changes to the hydrology. But we are restoring these kind of sites in Dumfries and Galloway as we speak. So often these sites are kind of lead to poor crop growth anyway. So the decision has been taken more and more to restore these kind of poor growth yield areas back to open bog. But really, in the past, what we've done is we've simply taken off the crop and sort of left the site to its own devices. but you're left with lots of drains and left with this weird ridge and furrow topography and sites that are very dry and scrubbing up. So this is totally atypical. You don't want to see this kind of conifer regeneration on a good bog site. So I talked about peat depth and why that is important to consider when we're designing our restoration plans. Well, we need to think about, well, how much time and effort went into changing that peat bog into becoming something else? And you can kind of think, well, that sort of time and effort, that resource has to go back into that site to turn it back again. So a really kind of simple thing was just simple draining. So simple, small drains dug quite frequently. Well, they're probably the easiest thing to fix. We go in and we simply install peat dams. So that's kind of low intervention, low disturbance type of restoration, usually quite kind of high up in the peat body and the peat profile. And then you move on to your bare peat restoration, where it may be a wee bit more invasive, but still really you're working with the surface peats, you're not going to any great depth. However, you may have to start thinking about quite engineered solutions because you're dealing with particularly big, deep drains on a site, so they need more engineering work. This is a plastic piling dam braced with timbers, for example, because it's holding back a lot of water because that drain was particularly large. And then you get to a situation, particularly in lowland raised bogs, and this is an example from further west in Galloway, the Moss of Cree, where we've actually installed what's called a trench bund. And that's basically an internal peat dam. So we've had to dig down into the peat, bring in nice fresh peat from just behind where the excavator, the machine would be sitting, and tamp that down into the hole we've created. And that creates a peat seal within the peat body itself. And we do that because this site was very degraded and had loads and loads of peat pipes, which, if you remember, are those voids in the peat body itself. So that allowed loads of water flow and this bog was too dry as a result. And those peat pipes were there probably in far more extensive kind of ways than it would be naturally, because this had a crop of trees on it sort of 15 years prior to our restoration. So we had to go in deep to try and solve that problem. And then probably the most invasive work that we do is forest to bog restoration. So if you think of all the work that went into that site to turn it into forestry, well, that similar amount of work has to go back into it to turn it back in to open bog habitat and restored kind of hydrology and ecology. And you can see here in this aerial photograph, you can see what we're dealing with is we've got these big artificial drains, and just under the text here, you can see quite a large area of erosion because of the drainage network and the water being moved through the site artificially. And you see these ridges and furrows and ridges and furrows, ridges and furrows, which all the furrows are transporting water as well to some extent. So you have completely modified topography. So we do a thing called stump flipping, which is basically getting all the old stumps, turning them over with an excavator, tramping over them in the excavator to flatten the whole site out. So we often refer to it as ground smoothing because you're getting rid of that topography. But that's the most invasive restoration that we do. And we're always looking for the lightest touch that we can. Certainly in my work with Peatland Action, our philosophy is the lighter the touch, but give the site time. That's what it needs to respond. So we don't always throw the kitchen sink at it. We try and take the lighter touch where we can because we want to avoid overall disturbance of the whole peat body. And that's really important when you're considering the historic environment, for example, which you'll hear a bit more about in a minute. So just before I wrap up, I just wanted to show you some examples of the kind of machines that you might see out on our peatlands. This is a really typical kind of 8-tonish low ground pressure excavator. And you can see here, he's built a nice composite dam. So it's plastic piling backed up with lots of peat here as well. And already that's starting to hold back water onto the bog. We use specialist forestry equipment. So a lot of this equipment is used for jobs in forestry industry and wind farm construction. Here we're seeing felling. You've got to take the crop off first. Another machine here to actually drive in the plastic piles for a dam. So it must be on quite a large drain to be going to that length to be putting the plastic in that site. And again, just a close-up of some of the machines that we're using. However, these are really, really on. Here's another machine used for mowing an area which to create mulch we can apply elsewhere in a bare peat site. But the key thing is, all these machines are working on really deep, often really deep, wet peats. So they have to be special machines. And the key thing is these are all called low ground pressure excavators because you see these very, very wide tracks. And this gives the whole machine much less ground pressure, so less kind of sinkability, if you like. Here's another example of a slightly modified version of that, where you can see actually the tracks have been modified, so there's actually spaces between the tracks, and what that means is when the excavator turns, it doesn't rip up the vegetation as much. So we've started to really develop tweaks and specialities in the machine that we're using in our peatland restoration. The key thing is, though, these things here, bog mats, so often just railway sleepers, but can be used by machines to track onto over particularly wet bits. But I would say the key thing of all when we're working on our deep, wet peats is the drivers. We have incredible drivers that are just so experienced at working on our peatlands that actually the instance of getting bogged on a site are relatively low. So we're very thankful to all the great skilled drivers out there. So just finally, here's some examples of peatland restoration you should be looking out for across the Galloway Glens area and wider actually. So here I talked about simple ditch blocking. We have a simple peat dam that's been constructed, already backing up water. This is a technique called hag reprofiling. So we take a hag that looks like that, which is just a bare peat face, it's eroding away. And through kind of manipulation of the turves and tamping down of the peat, we can create an angle like that, completely covered over with vegetation, so it stabilizes the area very quickly. We have interventions in gullies here. We have stone dams and some coir logs and geotextiles being used to slow the flow of water through a system. And here, closer to home, is one of my favourite sites. This is an example of a forest to bog project. And this is in the Clattering Shaws area. So if you remember my peat map right at the beginning, this is one of the lenses of deep peat that we've now actually restored. So by that I mean we've taken off the conifer crop, we've done the ground smoothing and the stump flipping. So we've turned a site like that to something that looks like this 18 months later. And this is already the right kind of vegetation coming back. This site is wet, it seems to be doing really well. And this is the kind of work we want to be doing more of in that Clattering Shaws area. So do watch this space. It's ever evolving and yes, lots more restoration work to come. So that's me. I'll leave it there, but happy to answer any questions just now if you've got time or in the chat bar throughout tonight's presentations. But yes, thank you very much for listening and do enjoy everyone else's presentations to come as well. Thank you.
Brilliant, Emily. I was probably meant to be keeping an eye on the questions coming in so I could ask you a couple, but actually I was just busy listening to you. So thank you very much as ever. That was brilliant. There are a couple of questions I'll put to you, but there's a number of questions in there, and Emily will go in and answer them through the evening. So just a couple here. Anne Johnson asked if there's any bog groups in the area, like Friends of the Bog, things like that. Are there groups in there? And I'm sure they'd be helpful if there were.
That's really interesting. I think there are lots of maybe wildlife groups and community groups that might have an interest in a bog local to them. I don't think we have any formal Friends of the Bog type groups, but it's something that we're thinking about doing because often we need a bit of help with some of our sites. We might need some volunteer effort at some point to come in and help maintain some of these sites. So it's definitely in the Carbon Centre's mind to maybe have some kind of a bog army that can come out with this and help sort of manage scrub, that sort of thing. So again, watch this space. I'll be more than happy to let you know more.
Yeah, so as soon as we get out of the sort of the situation we're in at the moment, we can work more freely.
Yeah.
You'd welcome volunteers coming out and helping you.
Yeah, yeah.
One last question then before we move on to the next presenter. So I was querying about the levels of peat which trigger an ability to make an application for funding, and should trees be planted on any peat, no matter how deep or shallow it is?
Yeah, so this is a really active area of discussion at the moment. I think what we're starting to see from the science, because remember all these decisions have to be based to some degree in expert knowledge and understanding in the science and the carbon numbers in particular. So we're starting to see sites that have been monitored over the longer term where we've seen crops of commercial trees growing on shallow peat soils, so soils less than 50 centimetres a day. Actually, overall, if you consider the life cycle of that forest, it's not been a carbon benefit after all. So there's much more debate at the moment as to where we should be planting, where we should be replanting as well. It's quite critical, particularly with the deep peats. So again, I would say watch this space, because things seem to be changing, and there's more science coming online, and it's making everybody more aware that the right tree has to go into the right place much more. And you'll see recently lots of media attention on this topic. Trees may not always be this carbon solution, that we need to be considering the organic soils at which these trees are being planted on as well. So it's a very, very active area at the moment. So yeah, more than happy for you to get in touch about that, but just keep your ears open. There'll be more to come on that.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and yeah, Emily keep answering questions in the chat room, and but a good point to end on there is that the aim of the game is to store and capture carbon. It's not to plant trees. So trees can be the right thing in certain places, but it's not in every place. And we must keep a crystal focus over the next decades on its capturing carbon. That's what it has to be. However, it's done through landscape restoration processes, which can be very diverse, but it's more about getting things back to natural systems working in a better way. Now, we're going to change tack slightly now. We're still on peatlands, but what I really liked about tonight is very much a multidisciplinary tonight. And our next speaker, Dr. Michael Strategos, I'm terrible at pronouncing names, so hopefully I'll call him Michael from now on. He can correct me when he starts. He's going to talk about the archaeology of peatlands and I guess how the trace of man on it, etc. He's an archaeologist who's done his postdoc research at the University of York and looking at Anthropocene biodiversity and studying historic changes to wetland environments. He's going to be up next. So, Michael, are you ready to go?
I am ready to go. Can you see my slides?
I can, and apologies if I pronounced your name in a terrible way. It's probably
No,
not the first person.
you were spot on, really, Nick. Spot on. So thank you very much, and I'm very excited to be here, and I'm hoping to provide an archaeological perspective, maybe a deep time perspective, to the history of bogs and other wetlands in southwest Scotland, and perhaps get a conversation going with Emily and others who are interested in here about how we do restoration and what kind of priorities we put on that process, and think about where and how we go about it. And so to that end, the first thing I'll start with is this slide. Emily mentioned silver flow, and the thing I want to emphasize here is that bogs in Scotland, in all of Britain and Ireland, and really arguably around the whole world, are deeply anthropogenic. They have a deep human history. They're frequently depicted as being devoid of human activity, devoid of much animal activity. But that's not really necessarily an accurate reflection of what's going on. And in this case, in the case of Silver Flow, it did not start out as a bog. Even in the immediate period after the glaciers melted in this area, it was initially a forest, and there was only bog species in small pockets in low-lying depressions. And you can see that in the pollen diagram on the right of this slide. This area of southwest Scotland, the Galloway Glens area, actually has a fantastic pollen record that was mostly collected in the 1970s and 80s. And there would be a lot of work that could be done revisiting some of that as techniques and methods have moved on. But this particular pollen core is interesting because it shows that history, that immediate post-glacial history of forest colonization, and it also links up well with the archaeological record that has come out of these bogs since in that same period in the Mesolithic, and what you get is stone tools. And the thought is that this region saw Mesolithic hunter-gatherers moving between the Solway coast and the Ayrshire coast. I think that interpretation is maybe a little bit old-fashioned. We now have evidence from elsewhere in Scotland where people seem to be making quite a big part of their lives in highland areas of Scotland, where when this work was done in the 70s and 80s, this pollen work, it was thought that it was just too cold for people to spend large parts of their time in these higher elevation areas. But regardless, it's pretty clear that not only were was this area not necessarily covered in bog in the way it is now or the way it was in the more recent past, but that people were actually managing that forest. There's pretty good evidence to suggest from those pollen records and from tiny bits of charcoal that get preserved in these pollen cores through the bog, that people were actually lighting fires to manage that forest. There's a bit of a question on whether these are natural or deliberately set and managed fires, but the consensus is in Britain, certainly, that Mesolithic people were probably lighting fires to manage forests for their preference, to be able to hunt the animals that they preferred easier or better. And what's interesting about this particular peat core is it shows very clearly about 6,000 years ago that change from forest to bog environment. And that change coincides very tightly with the change from hunter-gatherer lifestyles to agricultural lifestyles. So the change from the Mesolithic to the Neolithic. And what's interesting about that is it seems to be that introduction of grazing animals, sheep and cattle probably, that are, if not permanently, then at least occasionally grazing in these landscapes, that's enough to keep the forests from regenerating, and that allows the blanket bog to expand. And that human activity is, in some sense, at least mostly responsible for the development of these really vast expanses of bog in this particular case. And each bog around southwest Scotland and around the rest of the country will have similar kinds of stories, maybe less anthropogenically driven expansion of bog, maybe more, maybe almost none at all. But the point is that people were living in these landscapes, they were impacted by them, and they were impacting them, even to the extent of potentially being largely responsible for their creation. One of the other interesting things about this study, this Jones et al. 1989 paper, is that they had a whole Holocene core, so right from the end of the last ice age to more or less the present. And they noted at the top of the core, so the most recent period of time, that the loch that they took the core from indicated an acidification of the water. And the timing of that corresponds quite well, although they don't make much of it in the paper, with the intensification of sheep grazing and probably much more widespread drainage. And the implication there, to my mind, is that those exposed peat hags that we saw in many of Emily's photos in the last presentation are probably leaching that dissolved organic material into the water, along with the peatiness. The acidic peatiness is ending up in greater quantities in the loch. And that seems, to my mind, to be tied to intensification of grazing practices and probably the removal of people through the clearances. But as Emily mentioned as well, the development of peat and wetlands stores that history. And as an archaeologist, that history is most exciting to me when it comes in the forms of artifacts and archaeology. And the wetland archaeology of Southwest Scotland is fantastic. You get absolutely everything. You get some of the best of the full spectrum of wetland archaeology, and it tells that story, that human story of bogs and wetlands, from the building of medieval castles, which in the Galloway Glens region frequently occupy fluvial mounds, so that's river deposited sediment in quite strategic locations, using the river wetlands that surround them to probably control movement of people through this landscape, and of course to protect yourself in times of danger. Wetlands across southwest Scotland preserve the remains of prehistoric houses fantastically well. Crannogs are very near and dear to my heart. And there are many crannogs. These are artificial island dwellings set out into lochs. Many crannogs in southwest Scotland. The photo there on the top in the center is a crannog-like structure in the Black Loch of Merton, which is in the far southwest of Dumfries and Galloway. It's set out on a peaty promontory into a loch, so not a true crannog necessarily, but similar. And of course, as you can see, the fantastic remains of timber structural elements preserved there. And those, of course, themselves, the timbers themselves, preserve a fantastic record of past climate in their tree rings and past forestry management of the Iron Age people that built that structure. You also get burnt mounds across southwest Scotland. These are slightly enigmatic monuments. They're composed of lots of charcoal and burnt, cracked stones. There's 1,000,001 interpretations of what exactly they are. They tend to date from the Bronze Age, kind of around 1,500 BC, maybe 2,000 BC. Some people have suggested there may be saunas of some kind, or for working leather, making leather, and other interpretations besides. I think the answer probably lies in some combination of all and none of those interpretations. In addition to sort of settlement and sites where people did things, we also get a lot of stuff in bogs and wetlands in southwest Scotland. Bog butter is a common find in the 19th century. A lot of the examples of bog butter were found. That particular photo, I'm afraid, isn't from southwest Scotland. Particularly fine example of bog butter. It looks like you could put it on your toast. That actually comes from Northern Ireland, that particular example, and from a relatively recent period in the kind of late medieval period, about 400, 500 years ago. Beyond organics, you also get a lot of metalwork in the late Bronze Age, perhaps not too distant in time from the burnt mounds. You get lots of different types of bronze artifacts being deposited seemingly deliberately, very deliberately, in wetlands, sometimes deliberately broken and then put into the bog. That spearhead there came from a shallow bit of a loch. Moving on through time in the Iron Age, you also start to get different types of metalwork. That pony cap there, the tower's pony cap, a very famous example of Celtic art, probably sat on top of a horse's head. And I've spoken to the Galloway Glens a little bit about my work investigating the context of that find, and some of that information will come up in a moment as I speak more. But yes, needless to say, southwest Scotland is a fantastic representation of wetland archaeology through time, and all of this attests to that deep human history of bogs. Now, particularly with the stuff things, those artifact finds that have been made throughout southwest Scotland through time, we have to thank for their discovery, by and large, not exclusively, but by and large, we have to thank these drains. So those very things that Emily was saying were so bad, and they are so bad for keeping bogs wet, it was also the process by which we discovered a lot of this archaeology. And through the 18th and 19th century, it's really difficult to convey just how ubiquitous this practice was. Almost the exception to the rule is bogs and lochs and other wetlands that haven't seen any kind of drainage versus those that have. You can almost guarantee that every wetland in southwest Scotland has seen some amount of drainage, and the majority of that began at least in the 18th and 19th century. And this was part of broader trends in changes in agricultural practice, which moved away from subsistence practice, where people grew and managed what they could on land for themselves and a little bit extra, to capitalist modes of production, where landowners enclosed land, and drains and ditches were frequently a part of that process. Land was taken out of common ownership, so grazing areas, usually in upland locations, were fenced off and rented out instead of having common rights applied to those areas. And through this transition, almost every bog and loch was drained. And we can see this in the landscape, in the physical landscape today, where we went from a depiction of the landscape in the mid-18th century here on the Roy Military Survey to something like this, where the land was parceled up, wetlands were drained, and overall dewatered. And this is and that process was largely responsible for many of the archaeological discoveries that were made, especially of those small artifacts. To do much, because of the nature of archaeological investigation at the time, which was very much to kind of focus on the shiny stuff, to understand more about that shiny stuff, we have to do less than standard archaeological work. We can't just go to the exact find spot necessarily and open up a trench and find out more, because so often those find spots were not recorded. We just don't know where they came from. And that was certainly the case with the Torres pony cap, this very elaborate bronze artifact that sat on top of a horse's head. And as I mentioned, I spoke to the Galloway Glens about this late last year, so I won't rehash that whole talk. But the important thing is that through analyzing the drainage pattern, the timing and extent of drainage that occurred in the area that this pony cap was found, we were able to get really good, much better resolution on exactly where the pony cap was found. And it turns out that it was indeed from Torres Loch, almost certainly. And that's one out of about 5 other lochs it might have come out of. And I was able to narrow that down due to working out the timing of exactly when each of these basins was drained, and lining that up with what we knew about the discovery of the pony cap. And what's exciting about this to me is, in as much as we can learn really good and new information about this fantastic piece of Iron Age metalwork, it also highlights the nature of how we have conserved and designated biodiversity. Because Torres Loch is a SSSI, a site of special scientific interest. And as much as restoration programs and rewilding type efforts are fantastic, really important, it's also worth recognizing that many of the things that we value and cherish and protect, such as this SSSI, are in fact the result of entirely anthropogenic processes, even more than what I led with the silver flow. For instance, at Torres Loch, where this basin is designated for a community of bog and fen vegetation, which would not otherwise be there if not for that early 19th century drainage. If that loch had persisted, it would have been one loch amongst a handful in this part of southwest Scotland. But through that drainage, it was transformed to this unique fen environment that supports, among other things, this sedge grass, Carex rostrata. And so that's one of the interesting dynamics and the real value, I think, of applying this historical archaeological approach in contextualizing and understanding the transformation that is largely responsible for the wetland, the bogland, the peatland that we have today, which is that, by and large, 18th and 19th century transformation from subsistence to capitalist agriculture. Where the archaeology fits into this relates to that complex dynamic that I mentioned about 18th and 19th century discoveries. As I said, almost, not all, but a big part of what we know about wetland archaeology, and especially the artifacts, comes from those discoveries made in the 18th and 19th century when these places were drained. By digging in them, the artifacts were discovered, basically. But the legacy that leaves us is one where we don't have that really good spatial resolution until the type of work that I did for the Torres pony cap is done. And as a result, that leaves us with a situation where when we go to restore these landscapes, when we go to turn a forest back into a bog, or to block drains, we can have really poor control over what archaeology we might be encountering. And a good example of that is Loch Moss. Now, I don't mean to throw anybody under the bus, but I've seen a recent report about a really fantastic initiative to return Loch Moss to a raised mire, of which it's a fantastic example, one of the biggest in Scotland. And the technical report suggests that there isn't much archaeology to look out for. And I think that is a result of the fact that, yes, indeed, there isn't much archaeology recorded having come from the bog, but that is a result of the archaeology sitting slightly outside of the bog based on a very inaccurate grid reference. And that inaccurate grid reference is just to indicate that it came from somewhere in the bog because it was found in the 18th and 19th century. And you can see the list of different finds that were made. And so one of the things that I'm hoping to do in being here and engaging with colleagues such as Emily is to try and raise the profile of archaeology in this process. And one of the things that I hope to be able to do is provide that deep human context, as well as perhaps adding to some of the decision making. For instance, the fact that a logboat and a paddle came out of this moss might suggest that a significant portion of it was in fact open water at one time instead of simply a raised bog. So perhaps there's a discussion there about reinstating some of the locks that were also drained around Lochar Moss in the 18th and 19th century. And Southwest Scotland, just as a final note, I just highlighted just how massive Lochar Moss is here. It's definitely worth going to check out the Roy Military Survey and zooming around on it. It's a hugely extensive bog that extends many kilometers north from the Solway coast right up to north of Dumfries, and covers huge areas that I'm sure many of you have driven through and not necessarily even thought you were going through a bog, but there you are. And so, yeah, so just to finish up, just to re-emphasize that peatlands are these deeply human landscapes, and that as we continue to make decisions about how we restore bogs and wetlands, and we really do need to be doing that, that archaeology and historical archaeology, I think, has a very important role to play in helping to do that. In addition to providing that context, it might also help to decide where and what we do. And so with that, I will finish. Thank you very much. And hopefully I'll be able to answer some of your questions.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, it was really interesting. I come from an ecology background, like some of the others in this subject, but I'm well aware that we often forget that the ecology with most of the landscape is adjusted by man for thousands of years. And we have a big, rich culture, and we've got to be careful we don't destroy that culture and preserve it as much as possible. With also the idea that we've got to do things to probably restore the more recent damage that we've created. And I think that's an important thing to remember. It's there's a couple of questions came up. One that struck me because it was asked 3 or 4 times I saw in the comments section was a question about bog butter. People were querying, what is bog butter?
It's actual butter. This is butter that people made from cows or maybe sheep. It was put usually into timber buckets and then placed into the bog. There are examples that date back to the Bronze Age from Ireland. Exactly why people felt the need to do this is unclear in some cases. Some people have suggested it's ritual deposition, so some kind of offering. Others have suggested it imparts a flavor that was desirable. I have heard apocryphal tales of people tasting it. So yeah, I think the jury is still slightly out exactly on why, but what it is, it's butter.
Okay, I can see a couple in the videos actually based in Nottingham area that are looking like they're eating something with butter on it. So I'm wondering if that's bog butter that they've got there. Another question coming out then. This has come from a private chat from a guy called Bernard Saunders, and he's talking about, and this comes from Emily and Michael. Maybe if you want to think about this, throughout many of our wetlands of Scotland now, we're reintroducing beavers and things like this. This comes up at most of the presentations. Are we thinking that's a good thing? I'm looking at they're almost doing your job, Emily, in terms of creating further wetlands. Emily, are you there? Yes, sorry.
Yes, I'm there. Oh, great. The beaver question. Brilliant. Yeah, interesting. So kind of an ecosystem engineer, if you like, introducing the beaver, the idea being that you could sort of re-meander and slow the flow and hold back water in places and flood areas. I think it very much depends on the trees you're looking at, the type of land use going on as well. That, you know, the problem is in Dumfries and Galloway in particular, we have, you know, we're not somewhere like, I often find this in my role as a kind of peatland restoration person, we're not like somewhere like the Cairngorms with their vast areas of peatlands which are used for things like deer stalking, grouse management, but they're not seen as hugely productive always. Big estates have lots of different corners they can be doing different things on. In this region, most of our land is utilised. There's not many areas where you could introduce beavers that would have such a massive effect on the dynamic of an upper catchment, for example. So it'd have to be very, very carefully considered and what other activities that might displace. However, saying that, wetland creation, great. And actually wet woodland creation, we don't talk about wet woodland nearly enough. That's a massive kind of biodiversity and carbon win in itself. So maybe we should be thinking outside the box a bit more and thinking about holding back the water in different places, and not just on peatlands, but sort of fen areas as well.
Thank you. Okay, I think what we'll do is we'll move on. And Michael, if you could jump into the comment section as well, there's quite a few queries about specific sites that you may know and things like that, and maybe have a go at answering a couple of the comments in there. So next we're going to move on to Kate Foster. Kate is basically a brilliant artist, actually, but she has been looking at doing peat art around the area for a while. She's actually doing this presentation from the Netherlands, but she studied environmental art at Glasgow School of Art in 2001 and has been working on collaborations with partners of the Galloway Glens and also on the Tweed Forum. And yeah, I think her art's pretty cool, and I think she's going to show us some of it now and explain where it's come from. Kate. Are we there, Kate? Oh, we are. Over to you, Kate.
I forgot to unmute myself. Well, I'm going to give you a perspective on plumbing the depths of a bog from an environmental art practice. I'm really delighted to be here, and thank you for inviting me. And thank you for your kind words. So this talk will draw from my peat cultures project with the Galloway Glens and Crichton Carbon Centre that took place over 2019. And I'll introduce ways that I'm helping make peatland connections between the Netherlands and my base in southern Scotland. So this is an impression of the depths of a rain-fed lowland peat bog, something Galloway is really rich in. I was born with my toes in the East Anglian salt marshes, so a squidgy, muddy feeling shaped my sense of what makes up a good landscape. When I moved to Scotland to study and work, I thought at first that bogs were simply the wet areas between the hilltops. I now realise their importance in creating a sense of locality. They are elemental marker points, and I've become obsessed about the mosses and flows of the southern uplands and find that peat and wetlands is a great way to explore these places. I want to bring peaty landscapes into the picture. During peat cultures, I got more and more enthusiastic about things like peatland restoration and peat-free compost, and also beauties like sundew, dragonflies, the sound of curlews, and also eels, which I've never yet seen in a bog. This line is from Joss Smith, a poet. It's a banner for an event's Fagnum Splat and Forest D. Something as small as a wish can root and breathe the peat alive again. What kinds of things do I do as an environmental artist? I'll tell you about the process of making new connections and gathering people together, as well as some images and some texts and sounds. For me, it's a kind of research, collaborative and interdisciplinary. I work from a specific context and make something from this, so it looks different each time. I'm primarily a visual artist. With the Peat Cultures Project, I've also been skilling up as an artivist. I've been doing workshops and working with scientific and land management expertise, and of late, manipulating my artwork to fit into Zoom presentations. A silver lining of lockdown was the chance to collaborate with Pantea, an Iranian sound artist and filmmaker. We had to start to specialize in making remote connections to peatlands. The Amsterdam-based youth collective Repeat is also an inspiration. There are so many ways that wetlands and peat can inspire creativity. I'll admit some homesickness. I'm talking now from the Netherlands, a fantastic and unique place to learn about wetlands as cultural landscapes. Actually, most peat here has been dug away and drained. Nature reserves conserve what remains. And when I was able to visit in the heat of last summer, they were rather dry, like this one at the Grote Pijl in the South Netherlands. Galloway's bog seems like glittering jewels, and I find myself longing for a cool, damp day. I now want to show you different ways I found to explore Galloway landscapes through the medium of peat. When you learn about peat as a concept, it makes you think about what's under your feet. This is a bird's eye view of me trying to imagine what is underneath me. I drew it at Nautop Lochs, a Scottish Wildlife Trust near Corsic in Galloway in 2019. I was there preparing for a workshop for peat cultures led by Emily Taylor. Emily pointed out aspects of this site. When it was planted up, the peat was ploughed to make ridges for planted trees to grow on. Cross drains lowered the water table, and the compacted track that we walked on changes how the water moves through the peat. I'll go back and tell you more about the workshop in a moment, but first I'll tell you about a plant that I saw there and how this links the Peatland Connections logo. I had heard that cotton grass is an important component of peat. Small movements catch your eye in the bog. Seeing it in context is quite different from seeing it as a still image or a diagram. The moment had a shimmer, and I witnessed a tiny point of sequestration. I noticed that there were cotton grass seeds caught up in other plants. So walking on a bog made me see different interactions and connections over time and place. Looking at the surface of a bog can be a way of imagining its depth. When Jane and I were talking through what could work as a logo for Peatland Connections, I thought of this particular plant. Clumps of sedges stand for peatlands on maps, and I took the logo colours from the photo. Brown isn't that easy a colour to work with, but then peat is a delicious, deep, rich colour. The aim, of course, is to see less bare peat instead of vibrant living plant community. I'll go back to the workshop at Nautop Lochs. Emily welcomed us, a group of artists, at Corsic Village Hall. And she helped us get an ecological understanding of the area. At the start of the workshop, we learnt how deep peat develops, and that this is sphagnum, the moss which you can wring water out of. We got to guess the depth of the bog and probe the squidgy ground. It was about 4 or 5 meters in this spot. Pantea was here and also learnt to do this. We brought out the Russian Cora to see a professional method of extracting a peat sample. Emily guessed that this stretch of peat between her hands from the less compressed top zone would represent about 100 years of time. Gave us plenty to think about. How can we as artists engage with this sort of place? Robin Wall Kimmerer described it like this. The dead mosses are compressed by the weight of the water and the plants above forcing them downwards into the depths. This is the foundation of the bog, a huge sponge holding water and steadily passing it upwards from the unseen to the seen. It was a great day out on the bog in the June sunshine. And you can read more about this and all the other events and things I'm talking about on the Peat Cultures Project website. I'll explain now how en route to the Nautop Lochs workshop, I returned another peat core to the bog. And this is part of the backstory to Peat Cultures Project. It came from Kirkconnell Flow and was extracted during a workshop there in 2016. The core had spent 3 years in my freezer, just making outings to a couple of art events. And I decided that this wasn't justifiable energy-wise, and that I should return it to where it could best sequestrate. At the workshop in Kirkconnell Flow in 2016, it had been incredibly exciting to reach the boulder clay at the bottom of the peat. We cheered and felt as though we'd got down to the Ice Age. Someone said, "I've got goosebumps," thinking how the ice sheets ground stone into flour as they went over the landscape, and that what we are now looking at is what the ice sheets deposited when temperatures fluctuated and they melted. That was the group on the day. I wanted to know what best to do with this peat core. With Emily's advice and the landowner's permission, that's Scottish Nature, I found a suitable bog pool on Kirkconnell Flow. I've reflected on this event as a kind of personal farewell to the Holocene, and also written up how I've worked with the core on the way. I decided that my art should demonstrate that peat should be left in the ground. The next piece I'm going to mention is Mending the Blanket, which began as an illustrated booklet and postcards. Perhaps Galloway Glens still has some stocks, I'm not sure. It was inspired by the kinds of videos that Emily has shown us and her team uses for training in restoration techniques, and also Tweed Forum's work at Gameshope, an area that's owned by the Borders Forest Trust. I wanted to pay tribute to the field workers and the commitment needed to restore peatlands. So these are the drawings, and I'll read the text out. With rain, bog plants grow into a blanket covering upland slopes. Bog mosses make layers of carbon-rich peat from air and rainwater. The blanket is thinned by too much burning and grazing, leaving eroded shapes called hags. Wind and rain swiftly strips away bare peat, leaching carbon into the air and the rivers. A digger bucket smooths out the hags and replaces the turf, mending the blanket. The field worker surveys the new profile and checks if rainwater has started to pool. A new surface with the hope of bog moss taking hold again. Pantea and I made Mending the Blanket into a short animated film. We wanted to say together how wetlands are being valued across the world, and to create creative documentation to concerns which are usually characterized by scientific and instrumental explanations. You can see this in Alchemy Film Festival in Hawick in the Scottish Borders next weekend. For the last part of my talk, I'll talk about some work in progress developing from a studio exhibition last summer. It was titled Veencultuur, which roughly means peat cultures in Dutch. And working with the themes of the Home Turf project in Wageningen University, I was inspired by different kinds of knowledge about peatlands, such as archaeology and land management. This, of course, very much links to Michael and Emily's respective knowledge about groundworks and groundwater. I began to turn ideas and drawings I found in textbooks into figures, into shadow puppet characters. This one is a water table. Having a high groundwater level underpins all the other processes in a peat bog. However, the water table is often wonky and needs to be set right. These kind of characters can help play out the relationships between people and peat landscapes. And I think working with sound is really important for this. So here is an extract of a sound sketch of the water table. Pantea asked, what might the water table be saying? What might it sound like? We're just starting a new project to find ways of describing what goes on under the surface of a bog. That was a short extract. I'm afraid the sound is compromised by Zoom. It's part of a developing exchange through peat cultures and vein culture. The ambition is an accumulating collaborative exhibition that travels between the World Soil Museum in the Netherlands and Galloway, making stops en route in Amsterdam and Glasgow. Perhaps new work can help make stories connecting different times and places. Another figure is of traditional peat digging tools. These remind us of the immense labour it took to dig away peat bogs. These three Dutch ones are a hint that there has been an exchange of know-how between the Netherlands and the UK on matters of land drainage. Mechanisation has changed how we can shape the landscape. Here's a new forest road in the Scottish borders, and I became curious in drains that were revealed by the digging. I took a video of one of these truncated drains and sent it to Pantea. She worked with the ideas of flow, intensification, and emptiness. Here's a second sound sketch she's made from our collaboration in progress. I'll just play a few seconds. I've now begun looking at drains with new eyes from talking to Emily and Michael. I've heard that eels were commonly found in drains. For me, this is a new emerging boggy character to work with. And as a final idea to mention from work in progress, I learnt about the Tor's pony cap from Michael. The images engraved on it or embossed on it conjure images of abundance. Just think of the number of birds who must have been wheeling in the wetland skies when this was made. I want the single curlew, which is the first shadow puppet character I made, to become numerous again. To finish, I've been talking about culture in a broad sense. It includes a variety of skills and knowledge surrounding peatlands. And I'm with Repeat in working towards a peaty culture shift. These are some suggestions of where to look for peat cultures that I set out at the beginning of the project. So here they are. Many people are very knowledgeable about different aspects of peatlands. Perhaps you may think about mosses and flows in terms of their Gaelic or Scots place names, or you're interested in bog archaeology or medicinal and edible plants. You may be a bird watcher, or your focus might be landscape photography or painting. Makers and designers also may use peatland products or find inspiration from mosses and flows. Historically, peat has been dug for fuel using traditional methods. In some areas, it's milled industrially. Landscapers and groundworkers have their own vocabulary and methods to describe their work. Environmental scientists use survey methods and a specific terminology to describe peat formation and the different processes at play in wetlands. For a walker, a mountain biker, or a hill runner, the chances are that peatlands are part of your life. We may be aware of mosses tacitly as a squelchy surface to negotiate, or directly as a topic of poetry, of creative writing, and of natural histories. Let's imagine new peat cultures in the landscape. You've seen and heard various ways I've been working to bring peaty landscapes into the picture. Working with others, including Zone to Source in Amsterdam and Our Living Soil in UK, as well as those mentioned on this slide, I hope to help make new and lively peatland connections. And thank you.
Thank you, Kate. That was as rapt about that. It was really, really interesting. I think the humans have been living on this peat for left their mark, and cultures have grown up with it for thousands of years. And I think this is what's linking this event together quite well. If you could, like Michael and Emily, could dive into the chat room and start getting involved in there, that'd be really good. I want to keep us moving on now, though, to our next presenter, Professor Thomas Clancy. Thomas has been working with us at Galloway Glens on the Place Names project. Place names of Galloway are quite unique, with multiple different languages kicking around them. I'm sure Thomas will speak to us about. Thomas has been the Professor of Celtic at Glasgow University now for over 25 years, and working with other partners, Gilbert Marcus and Simon Taylor, on a Galloway Glens project. Thomas, I think you're ready to go.
I think so. Can you hear me okay?
We can all hear you perfectly.
Brilliant. Thanks very much.
Over to you, Thomas.
Great. Thanks. It's been great to hear these previous talks. And as you'll, I think, realize quite soon, I'm probably the least knowledgeable about actual peatlands. My expertise lies in names and languages, and that's what I'll be talking about. I've given my talk a slightly different title, Risky Business, and hopefully you'll spot the bit where that title makes sense in a moment. Let me just, there we go. So my talk this evening emerges out of one of the Galloway Glens Landscape Partnership's subsidiary projects, the Place Names of the Galloway Glens, which some of you have maybe heard us talking about this project last spring. I think we gave a presentation about it, introducing the online resource for it. And a lot of what I say today comes from that project, and the data and analysis produced primarily by my colleague, Gilbert Marcus, who I think is here out there somewhere this evening. I hope, if nothing else, my talk will prompt you to go off and play with the resource a bit. This is just the kind of introductory page, or an older version of the introductory page that you'll see. And the URL is there if you want to go play with it. I'll just be dipping just below the surface, really, of what this resource can tell you. So in this short talk, I want to introduce some of the keywords used for bogs and peatlands in the Galloway Glens area as they're found in place names. And just to clarify, I'm going to be mainly talking about names in the area that we surveyed for the Place Names project. I mean, I should really say Gilbert surveyed, because he did the bulk of the work. That's the 7 parishes in the north of the Galloway Glens Landscape Partnership area. Now, early on in the planning for this series of talks, I think Nick joked that Scotland had multiple words for bogs in the way that legendarily the Inuit have words for snow. This is probably not actually far off the truth, even if they're not all represented in the Galloway Glens area. So here's a list of some common words in the different historical languages of Scotland for bogs and such like things as they're found in place names. And I've culled these from 2 of the full surveys of Scottish counties that are out there, those in Fife and Kinrossshire. They're not really representative of the country of Scotland as a whole, but just to give you a sense, I'm not going to go through them all. First, there are names drawn from, there are words that form place names in Gaelic and either Pictish or Brittonic, these ones here, and then words that form names in Scots as well. I've added one at the bottom that I'm not going to talk about because it would be the subject of an entire talk, and that is the word Carse and its Gaelic relations. But I did note Kate talking about Corsoc, and I just wanted to flag that up just before I go on. Now, of those many names that I've put up here, not all of them are found in the Galloway Glens area, but there are also some that are found here that are not found elsewhere, or weren't found in Fife and Kinrossshire, or maybe better represented in the southern part of Scotland. That's true both of the Gaelic and Brittonic names, and it's true of the names in Scots as well. Note here particularly flow, which is a Scots word particularly used in the southwest, and as I think Emily mentioned, up in the north as well. Now, just very briefly, I'm not going to go to town on this at all, but just to give you a little bit of context, just as there's a kind of stratigraphy in the bogs for the archaeology and for pollen cores and the like, so too we have a whole series of languages in the Galloway Glens as found in place names sequentially, chronologically. Very briefly, we've got evidence of Northern Brittonic, also called Cumbric, a language very like Welsh, evidence of Old English, sometimes called Anglian or Northumbrian. We've got evidence of Old Norse, although not really much from the Galloway Glens area specifically. We've got lots and lots of evidence for Gaelic and Scots, and last of all, Scottish Standard English. Almost all of the names I'm going to be talking about were coined either in Gaelic or in Scots, just I suppose as it happens. What's certainly the case, and I want to stress this, is that bogs and peatlands are zones of cultural and linguistic exchange, of connections in language and culture, just as they are in other ways, as other speakers have mentioned. That's something I really want to emphasize in my talk. And you can see this just from the fact that both the words bog and peat are words which have come into Scots and then English from Gaelic, certainly in the case of bog, and potentially from Northern Brittonic in the case of peat. I don't want to dwell on these slides too much. I'm kind of hiding behind dictionary definitions and etymologies, neither of which I'm entirely happy about, but you'll see that bog comes from the Gaelic word bog, meaning soft originally. Doesn't start out meaning a bog, so presumably soft ground, soft land, and hence ultimately a bog. Peat is more difficult. People keep saying etymology unknown, but one good suggestion is it comes originally from a Brittonic word meaning a portion, and initially then a portion of the peat, a tarf, and then eventually, like the word tarf itself, coming to mean the peat itself. So I don't want to, like I said, I didn't want to go to town on the etymologies, but just to give you a sense that there's maybe a kind of time depth and cultural connections lying behind both our common words, bog and peat. Neither word starting out meaning what they eventually come to mean. And I think something maybe just worth saying here is that English and the Scots, the other Germanic languages, they had lots of words for wetlands themselves. And we need to wonder, I suppose, at the precise nature of the social context in which words like this came from one language into another. As they appear in the Galloway Glens area, though, both of these words, peat and bog, are Scots words, and to some extent later English terms as well. Peat only appears as a defining word for places, a modifying word. Peat Hill, Peat Rig, Peat Knows, what we call in place names the specific element in a place name. And when you see these locations in the landscape, often raised land above a moss or peat bog, you can see that in these two images, Peat Rig and Peat Hill here. It makes it likely that these were places where extracted peat was collected and dried rather than the place where peat was found. And I've noticed this with most of the peat names in our area. And interesting, just as a kind of aside, an interesting disappearing peat name is Paddy's Bank Wood. I don't know if that's exactly how people pronounce it, which starts out life in the 19th century. Our earliest record is as Peat House Bank Wood. And I know Gilbert's suggested that perhaps the original name was seen as a wee bit common, and someone tried to sort of doctor it, but we'll maybe never know exactly what happened. Bog, on the other hand, appears in various ways. On its own, in Bogue, in the farm of Bogue in Dalry. But also as the generic element, the element described in places like Ellerbog, Oakenbog. That's a bog with alder trees, a bog with oak trees originally, or Fiddler's Bog. But like peat, it can be used as the defining element, the specific in a place name like Bog Hall. The most interesting, I think, of all the bog names in our area is Bog of Allen in Parton Parish. This is a transferred name from the enormous peatlands in Ireland. It's the Ordnance Survey name books from the middle of the 19th century say it's said that the origin of its name is from the circumstance of persons from Bog of Allen in Ireland cutting peats here. That may well be, but still in all, the Bog of Allen is huge. It's found in 9 counties in Ireland. And I do wonder whether it's a sort of ironic name for a small patch of peat bog, a sort of over exaggeration, or maybe it was just really productive of peat. I don't know. But maybe it was some visiting workman. Some terms are only found rarely in Galloway. One example is the Gaelic word riasc, fen or marshy ground. This appears in a few place names in Galloway as risk, including one in Balmagee and another one down in Borg Parish. And it should be said that the word riasc was also taken into Scots as risk, later risk, hence risky business. This is the moment where you spot the point of my title. Defined as moorish or marshy ground covered with coarse grass or sedge, unproductive land. This makes it kind of difficult to be absolutely certain in the case of risk in Balmagee, for instance, whether it is in origin a Scots or a Gaelic name. But the probability, given the dominance of Gaelic settlement names nearby, is that it is Gaelic. This example is also interesting because risk in Balmagee is not obviously boggy ground any longer. The Roy's map from the mid-19th century reveals it to have been near a bog. You actually saw this area in one of Michael's slides. This is exactly the area where he showed a heavily drained bit of Balmagee Parish. You might have noticed this name, Dunjap, down in the corner of one of his slides. This is not far from Thrieve. One potential development from place name survey is an ability, allied where possible with both scientific study and old maps and the like, to identify former bogland that's since been drained. Though I have to say, compared to the scientific scientific tools we have available, names are probably a pretty blunt instrument, but nonetheless, there it is. Much more straightforwardly, Gaelic as an element is Máine, by far the most usual word in Gaelic for peat bog or moss, also meaning peat in and of itself sometimes, is very common throughout the Gaeltacht, but perhaps less common in the southwest, or rather, and I don't really have time to explain this in detail, it's probably harder to spot since there's a bunch of other words that look a little bit like it. And end up in anglicized form. They all end up looking a little bit like each other. And only kind of detailed study of the places themselves really give you a sense of what the name probably is. There are 2, I think, really clear examples in the Galloway Glens area, though I think in our resource we hedge our bets a bit. One is Monibui, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that exactly the right way, in Balmaclellan, whence Monibui flow. Which is Máine Bhuile, the yellow bog. This is a name attested elsewhere in Scotland, in its Gaelic form, in fact. The yellowness of the moss might relate to the presence of yellow flag iris, but there may be other explanations that the scientific members of the panel could perhaps suggest. Less obvious on the surface of it is, and I'm really don't know how locals pronounce this, so I'd be very grateful of a lesson. I'm going to say Munchill, but I'm not really sure about that. This is in Dalry Parish, and Both the early forms, you'll see them here, of this sort of unpromising name, and the nearby peat knaus, which you'll see on the map, suggest strongly, despite its current form, that this contained Monya originally. And you'll see, I hope, that its situation perfectly suits what its name probably meant. Monya Hul, back bog, hidden away moss, the peat bog of the Nuke, something along those lines. And there it is, kind of tucked away between the hills. Now, without doubt, the most common boggy element in the Galloway Glens area in the place names is moss. And I'm just going to spend a little bit of time with moss as the sort of final element of my talk. This word, which is defined for Scots as meaning boggy ground, moorland, also a peat bog, a stretch of moorland allocated to tenants for cutting fuel. This existed also in Old English, and an equivalent word existed in Old Norse, mos, mosi. Now you might want to think, just to think about that sort of English connection in place names of Moss Side in Manchester. It might be the thing that springs to mind. And we've got several Moss Sides in our area as well. I've mentioned one here in Parton Parish. The bulk of the Moss names in the Galloway Glens area are Scots or English names. And again, either Moss is the defining element, the specific, in the case of Moss Side, Moss Park, Moss Head, or more often, it's the element being described, the generic, in Green Moss, Piper's Moss, Smitten's Moss, etc. And the Ordnance Survey name book often contains little, probably fictional stories about how things got their names. You know, a piper once piped on this moss, hence Piper's Moss. Sometimes they're not very informative, these. However, I said most of these are Scots or I suppose potentially English. Two names in our area operate differently, and that's Moss Raploch and Moss Roddock, now contained in Moss Roddock Loch. These names are in Gaelic word order. That is, the moss, which is being described, comes first, but the defining element, the specific, comes second. That's normal Celtic Gaelic word order. And that's one of the reasons we have a sense that this, you know, aside from the fact that it's not transparent to understand that these are Gaelic names. The second element of each of these names is not straightforward, but I've made a couple of suggestions here. Not entirely sure about Moss Roddock, but Moss Raploch, I'm fairly confident of Moss Rapaloch, the noisy or rustling moss. And having just heard Kate's sound sketches, that makes me feel even more confident about this as a potential meaning for this name. Moss Roddock is interesting. The Ordnance Survey name books tell us the portion of ground on which it is was formerly a peat moss, and in consequence of it being all cut and used for fuel and taken away, it filled up with water and formed itself into a loch. And just as we've seen with some of the other places I've mentioned already, here next to the site is one of the peat rigs I've mentioned already. Now, these two names belong to a whole series throughout southwestern Scotland, with a few more easterly examples, where the word moss seems to have been brought into Gaelic, probably, but not certainly, from Old English as a loan word, just as we've seen happening with riask and bog in the other direction, from Gaelic into Scots. Mossgiel near Mauchline in Ayrshire is probably the most famous of these because of the Robert Burns connection, but there are many more, and I've just given you a couple of examples here. There's maybe even one example of moss appearing in a Gaelic name as the specific rather than the generic in Drummamoss in Kirkcudbright, which place name people will be interested in, but maybe the rest of you will think, what's he on about? It does look as if the word may even have been taken into Northern Brittonic or Cumbric, as well as into Gaelic from Old English, judging from some names further east in Peebleshire and Roxburghshire, which are best explained as Brittonic names. Moss Fennin, Moss Peeble, Moss Paul are the ones I've put up here. Now, I should say that other proposals have been made for what these names mean, indeed what even the moss in these names mean, and I'm sort of skating over all that just to give you my take on it. But if you want more on the subject, there's a whole blog on the place names of the Galloway Glens website. You can find it there. My two favorite examples of these of moss with Gaelic in Gaelic form comes from further, excuse the typo, Borg parish, the border of Borg and Twynham parish. These two mosses confront each other, Moss Feather and Moss Mall. My take on these is that, and other explanations have been suggested, is that Moss Mall is the smooth, placid bog, Moss Maul in Gaelic, and Moss Feather is the savage or wild moss. And I've not actually had a chance to visit these since I've been working on this topic, and I'd quite like to go see them to see whether there's any reason why these two adjectives might be applied. One final point about the mosses in the Galloway Glens area, and then I'll stop. This was discussed by Gilbert Marcus in a bog blog that he wrote called One Bog, Three Names, How Good Fences Make Good Neighbors, and you can read all about that on our website. The point here is that many of the mosses in our area bear the name of the farm to which they belong. These were valuable resources for farmers. If you had your own access to moss for fuel, among other things, you were particularly blessed. And this one moss, from an ecological point of view, has been divided into three, with different bits of it belonging to the farms, respectively, of Drumbrek, Bargatton, and Barend. And I recommend Gilbert's little blog on that, just as a way of thinking differently about mosses in the human landscape in the past of the Galloway Glens area. So this has been a very rapid romp through some of the names. There's a lot more that could be said, many other names and elements to explore. What would be particularly fruitful for us as place names people would be to get a sense from scientists of whether different words for bog correspond with something different in their actual features, either words that are used now or words that were used in the past, or whether terms like bog, moss, flow, as used in place names in the past, are simply interchangeable words. I suspect it's the former rather than the latter, and I look forward to talking more to other members of the panel about this in the future. And I think with that, I think I've come to the end of my talk. Thanks very much for that.
Thank you very much, Thomas. As ever, incredibly interesting. And some of the place names stuff I really quite like about it, but you end up with these sort of like slightly contrary opinions on things because some of it goes back so far. So I'm going to, one question that's come in on your talk about the yellow bog, and why not yellow bog asphode, as in toxic to stock? Any thoughts on that?
No, I welcome all suggestions, really, as much as anything else. I think it would be useful to know from people with a more ecological sense of what's going on in bogs, what the most likely explanation where we get. There's quite a number of these, not just with Monya, but several other elements as well. These yellow yellow adjective used with boggy elements. So, but I'm writing that down.
Okay, it's in the comments section, and you'll be able to answer the person directly if you go into the comments section now yourself and have a little bit of a trawl through what's been said there and try and answer some of the queries. That would be great. We're running slightly late, but to be honest with you, I hadn't noticed. But we're going up next to Jane, who is going to be talking about her project. So Jane's the Peatland Connections Officer. As Jane and myself have put this together, most of this was Jane's work in terms of the ideas, etc. Jane is going to introduce her project to you all. but she has a background in environmental management. Is a professional IEMA member. She's also a photographer, and we do quite a lot of work with drones and things. So without keeping you going any longer, Jane, are you ready?
Oh, wow, that was amazing. Absolutely amazing to hear from lots of different perspectives. And it's a really nice place for me to now introduce Peatland Connections, which is a project that one of our main purposes is to bring together lots of different perspectives, lots of different experts from different disciplines, and bring this all together. That is the basis of what Peatland Connections has at its heart. So Peatland Connections is a Crichton Carbon Centre project. I'm the project officer. We've been running now for the past few months, and we're starting to get established on social media. We've got a presence on social media now. We're starting to connect people. We're starting to connect with experts, with the local community, and also with people further afield. So it's really exciting. It's a really exciting project. So where's the project based? We're based mainly in the Galloway Glens. That's where the project area is. And as you can see from this map, there's lots of little pockets of peat within that area. And we're hoping to speak to local communities and get their perspective on peatlands, what they think about them, how they feel about peatlands, what they mean to them. Do they know what peatlands even look like? Do they know what's on a peatland? We want to ask lots and lots of questions. So the basis of the project, it has got lots of different elements. The thing that ties it all together is about connecting us back to peatlands. Peatlands have been such an important part of our cultural heritage, and they've kind of, as time has gone on, we've lost a bit of that connection, and it would be really lovely to try and connect us back and get people out on the peat, get them thinking about peatlands again. And there's so much around peatlands at the moment, and so many different disciplines are coming together and really focusing. We've got a lot of peatland restoration. We've got artists that are really engaging in peatlands and really inspired by the beautiful landscapes there and all the diverse interests in life. So we're going to be connecting back through science, arts and culture, and bringing people together to form really interesting discussions like this evening, where you're seeing lots of different perspectives. Another element that we have throughout the 3 years of the project, we're going to try and define the natural capital of peatlands, so that we can help develop a tool that will inform land use and inform where peatland restoration should be done. We're also going to do a small water quality monitoring project, and hopefully that will turn into a citizen science project. And we're really going to try and connect back nature and culture, because I know that's quite a difficult thing to do, so that's one of the aims of the project as well. So on social media, I've been posting sort of daily, asking questions like, do you know anybody that's making peatland art? Do you know any songs about peatlands? Do you know what peatlands look like? Do you know what species are on peatlands? Do you know if you were on a peatland, what would you hear? What would you see? What would you smell? So we're asking all these questions just to get people interested. We're also giving information, stats on carbon and also what happens on peatlands, and people seem to be really interested in these little facts. And again, the main thing is that we're trying to create a community where we've got a discussion happening. So we're giving information, but we're also getting information back. So it's a two-way, really interesting conversation. We're hoping that as the project goes on and as things start to open up, we'll be able to do events out on the peat. What we want is to make really interesting, exciting events that people want to come to, and when they go away, they go raving to other people and say, yeah, we want to go out on the peat and we want to learn more, and let's all get together and talk things peaty. And we realise as well that not everybody can physically get out on the peat for lots of various reasons, and we know that over the last year that sometimes you don't actually physically have to go there. We can go live, we can bring the event to you into your home, or we can video it and we can put it online and then you can watch it from the comfort of your own home as well. So we're going to be looking at lots of different ways where we can interact with people and bring the peat right into your home, or bring the peatlands right into your home. We'll be talking to lots of experts, getting them on board, artists, scientists, bringing them in to run these events and workshops. So it should be really exciting. All the details will be on our website, which is www.peatlandconnections.com. So because we're bringing together the scientific and the artistic community, I wanted to start the project off by bringing in 2 artists. So Kate Foster, who you heard her fantastic talk earlier on, Kate created our lovely Peatland Connections logo, which gives us a really distinctive look that will carry on throughout the project. And also we had Alan McClure, who's a local musician. He did the Peatland Connections theme tune, which I'm going to do a little video at the end. Hopefully, fingers crossed, it'll work, and the music's on that. So we wanted to have the visual and the auditory that's just a thing that carries on through the whole project and gives us a lovely theme throughout the whole thing. So the local community, we really want to engage with them because their opinion is so important. We really want to ask all of these questions about what peatland means to them. What values do peatland hold? And then also to determine what benefits peatland have for us all. So we want to ask what your thoughts are, what the local community's thoughts are. But if you're not in the Galloway Glens area, it doesn't matter. We still want to hear from you. We want to hear nationally, internationally. We want to connect up the whole world through peatlands, which is exactly what they do. I heard someone say that in another talk, he said, we're connected through peatlands, and I thought, what a beautiful idea and what a beautiful thought, and it's very true. So we want people to come along to our events or watch them online if you're not near here. Please engage in the conversation. We have a steering group as well, because it's really nice, as we've seen this evening, to have lots of different perspectives. It brings up interesting conversations. We have a different thought process, and it creates a discussion that possibly we wouldn't have without having all those different people. So we've got fisheries, peatland scientists, archaeologists, artists, community representatives, forestry, ecologists, and we have a great discussion. We've had one meeting so far, so many ideas came out of it. One of them is thinking about language. So we're thinking, okay, we've got the technical language that we have, and then we've got the descriptive words. And then from each discipline, people have their own particular words. So let's bring them all together. So we were thinking there's also made up words. So there's a word called squadgy. So if you're out in the peat and the peat's feeling a little bit squadgy, what does that even mean? Who knows? But we're trying to bring it all together and make it really interesting, and we'll give it over to the artists who will develop this really interesting dictionary for us as well. And that'll be a nice legacy for us to leave with the project. So the very final part of the project, after 3 years, we are going to create an exhibition that will visually tell the story of the whole project. And it's going to take us on an experiential journey at the end of the project, that people can come along and see exactly how the whole story of the project has unfolded and what's happened, and then all of the beautiful art that's been made, music, stories, songs, all in one place. So we have, these are our social media connections. You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, or on Twitter, and please come along and engage, join in the discussion and share with us, come along, join in the events. If you've got something to tell, whether it be a personal story or whether it's something that you've heard, a memory, a song, whatever. We would love to hear it. We're collecting all of this information, and we really want to bring peatlands to life. We want to make them a really interesting place again, where people remember these really interesting things from our past, so that we can take peatlands into the future and they become part of our modern culture again in a really interesting and exciting way. So now I'm going to try my best, fingers crossed, that the drone footage will work with our little video. If you just bear with me 2 seconds until I change over here.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you. And I would like to say thank you so much to Galloway Glens for hosting this evening and having us on the panel. It's been lovely being here.
I think I've certainly enjoyed it, and a big thank you to all the speakers. We're actually a little bit over time, so I'm going to make a couple of comments I've seen. There's the best comment I've seen in the whole comment section. I have got no idea what the context is for this. I just saw it come up, and it says, I don't know who posted it. We can maybe explain it in an email to me later. It's stated, it makes the sheep's photosensitive and their ears fall off. I haven't got a clue what that came from. It was just something I saw in the comment section, which I think is my take home for the evening. I'm now finishing these events until October. We'll be doing another series in October on different natural sciences and things like that. So without further ado, I'm going to do what I traditionally do when I finish something. And I've got myself a little bottle of bubbly here. I'm going to open that. I hope you can hear that. I'm going to pour myself a glass of bubbly. I'm going to turn my video off, and I'm going to close the meeting down. But if you'd like to all unmute and just give a round of applause to all of the participators, that has been a really good evening. Thank you very much indeed, everyone.